Hello, I'm Doug Wentz, and welcome to Make Moderates Matter. The U.S. just held the November elections a few days ago, and I'd like to offer some thoughts about the results from a moderate perspective. Stay tuned. Welcome back. By all accounts, the 2025 election was a big night for the Democrats. USA Today reported that Democrats swept the elections in New York City, Virginia, New Jersey, and California. And The Hill quoted Republican Senator Ted Cruz from Texas as saying that the elections were a disaster for the Republicans. There was good news for moderates in New Jersey and Virginia. Former Congresswoman Abigail Spanberger won Virginia's governor's race to become the state's first female governor, and former Congresswoman Mikie Sherrill won the New Jersey governor's race. Both had resumes that should appeal to moderate voters. Spanberger is a former CIA case officer, and Sherrill was an active-duty helicopter pilot for the Navy. Both also had a history of bipartisanship during their years in Congress. As 29 News in Charlottesville reported, Spanberger was ranked by the nonpartisan Common Ground Committee as the most bipartisan member of the Virginia delegation in Congress. And the same committee ranked Congresswoman Sherrill as the most bipartisan elected official in New Jersey. In addition, as the AP reported, both candidates actively distanced themselves from some of the Democratic Party's far-left policies, focusing instead on rising costs for groceries and health care. Indeed, Spanberger emphasized in her victory speech that her win was a victory for pragmatism over partisanship. The success of Sherrill and Spanberger has broader implications beyond just their respective states. The AP noted that a growing number of Democratic leaders now believe that the moderate approach holds the key to the party's revival, after the GOP won the White House and both congressional chambers last year. Moreover, it's not just moderates who are drawing attention, but moderate Democratic women. A recent article in the Washington Post cited not only Spanberger and Sherrill, but also Senator Alyssa Slotkin of Michigan as three centrist women who are seen as leading Democrats in 2025. And of course, as I mentioned in episode 1, the moderate Democrats' Mod Squad PAC now is chaired by another woman, Senator Catherine Cortez Masto of Nevada. As reported by Politico, Masto is urging fellow Democrats to focus on economic issues and drop purity tests that some moderates and progressives alike have cast as damaging to the party. In sum, these moderate Democratic women are truly making history before our eyes, and I look forward to taking a closer look at this development in a future video. Having said all of that, in New York City, the election results suggest another very different path forward for the Democrats. Self-proclaimed Democratic socialist Zohran Mamdani made history as the first Muslim and first millennial elected to be New York City mayor, and he defeated both former New York Governor Andrew Cuomo, who ran as an independent, and Republican Curtis Sliwa. As NPR reported, Mamdani ran a grassroots campaign that included a variety of promises with a socialist flair, like making the city's buses fare-free, freezing stabilized rents, providing universal child care, and increasing the minimum wage, all of which would be funded by raising taxes on big corporations and the wealthiest 1% of New Yorkers. At this point, it remains unclear whether Mamdani can achieve his stated objectives, but in general, his election was not a victory for moderates from a policy standpoint. I also have to say that I personally am concerned that Mamdani's election may spurn further division. Fox News reported, for example, that Mamdani's victory not only was a shot in the arm for the socialist movement, but also a political gift for the Republicans. Indeed, as CBS News reported, in the wake of Mamdani's victory, President Trump now is claiming that the midterm elections in 2026 will be a choice between communism and common sense. Although, to be clear, Mamdani has never characterized himself as a communist, but rather as a democratic socialist. In response to these comments by Trump, as Newsweek noted, Mamdani appears to be gearing up for a fight. Unlike Spanberger in Virginia, who promised pragmatism over partisanship, Mamdani, in his victory speech, made a point of shouting, "So Donald Trump, since I know you're watching, I have 4 words for you. Turn the volume up." Zohran Mamdani. This retort certainly drew cheers from a partisan crowd, but it also, I fear, may galvanize many Republicans who will be eager to fight back. I guess it's pointless to ask both sides to tone down the rhetoric, but I hope that Mamdani's election will not further invigorate the polarized extremes of the political spectrum that have been tearing our country apart. Meanwhile, in California, as NPR reported, voters easily approved Proposition 50 to change the state's congressional map to increase the number of Democratic representatives. The irony of this, of course, is that previously 92% of California voters had approved the creation of a nonpartisan redistricting commission to allow an independent group to handle the redistricting process instead of the partisan politicians in the state legislature. As NBC News reported, the California system had been viewed as a national model for the best way to combat gerrymandering, but Prop 50 bypassed that process. In fact, this is just the latest twist in the gerrymandering battle royale that, as I mentioned in my first video and as reported by USA Today, began when Texas Republicans, at the urging of President Trump, took the extraordinary step in August of approving a new state congressional map without waiting for the next census. Their intention, as Trump readily admitted, was to flip 5 U.S. House seats to Republican in the 2026 midterm elections. In response, then, Democrats in California and elsewhere threatened to do the same, which in turn led even more Republican-controlled legislatures to do likewise. At this point, as reported by ABC News, California now is the 5th state that has redrawn its congressional maps for partisan gain in recent months, following Texas, Missouri, North Carolina, and Ohio. Suffice it to say that, in my view, the answer to partisan gerrymandering is not more gerrymandering. Instead, as I noted in episode 1, a better approach is to implement proportional representation with multi-member districts, which would completely circumvent the gerrymandering concern. I plan to say more about this soon in a separate video that will be dedicated to the gerrymandering problem. Of course, while most of the attention in the November election focused on the governor races in New Jersey and Virginia, the mayor's race in New York City, and Prop 50 in California, there were other races and issues on the ballot as well, and I'll mention a few more that I think have some relevance for moderates. First, I feel compelled to note that, unfortunately, in the November election, political violence, or at least violent rhetoric, once again reared its ugly head. About a month before the election, NBC News reported that Jay Jones, the Democratic candidate for Attorney General in Virginia, sent text messages in 2022 which suggested that Virginia's then House Speaker Republican Todd Gilbert should get quote-unquote 2 bullets to the head. And another text from Jones even discussed violence against Gilbert's children. Jones did not deny the accuracy of the reports, took full responsibility for his actions, and apologized to Gilbert and his family. Nevertheless, the question that remained for the November election was whether the voters would feel that Jones's actions were disqualifying, and apparently they did not. As NBC News reported, Jay Jones won his race for Virginia Attorney General, and it wasn't close. Democratic voters told NBC News that while they strongly objected to the texts, they voted for Jones anyway to give Spanberger an ally to help achieve her policy goals. For my part, as a political moderate, I find this result disturbing, as it would seem to be a victory for partisanship over principles. In my mind, moderates must always, without exception, condemn and not reward violent rhetoric. Despite Jones's apology, I personally cannot imagine any justification for wishing violence against a political opponent and their children. And this certainly should apply in particular to anyone aspiring to be the Attorney General who is charged with being the chief law enforcement officer of a state. Of course, political violence and violent rhetoric is not only directed at Republicans, but Democrats as well, and is an ongoing problem. As NBC News reported, in June of 2025, former Democratic Minnesota Representative Melissa Hortman and her husband were killed at their home in what officials called a politically motivated assassination. And in September, Charlie Kirk, a mobilizing force for young conservatives and a co-founder of Turning Point USA, was shot dead at an event in Utah at the age of 31. I plan to say more about the problem of political violence and violent rhetoric in a future video, but for now, suffice it to say that in my mind, moderates should abhor political violence and violent rhetoric in all their forms, and regardless of against whom they are directed. On a more positive note, in the 2025 election, the Forward Party had a number of successes. The Forward Party, as I noted in my first video, was formed to appeal to what it calls the moderate common sense majority. Its website is at forwardparty.com, and its founding co-chairs include Andrew Yang, a businessman, lawyer, and former Democratic presidential and New York mayoral candidate, and Christine Todd Whitman, a former Republican governor of New Jersey. In 2025 election, as reported by WCDB News, Jay Doyle became the mayor-elect of Georgetown, South Carolina, running on the Forward Party ballot line as a Forward Party candidate, and won with 56% of the vote. This was a significant achievement and shows that despite the concern about third-party candidates acting as spoilers in our winner-takes-all plurality voting system, a third-party candidate can sometimes actually win outright and not just compete. And in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, as reported by WHYY News, the Forward Party endorsed Danny Sessler, who was elected sheriff and defeated an incumbent in one of Pennsylvania's most closely watched local races. In total, the Forward Party reported at least 18 wins in the November 2025 election. And I have to say that I'm not surprised by these results, as polling continues to show that voters have a dim view of both major political parties. NBC News reported in early November, just before the election, that only 28% of registered voters surveyed had a positive view of the Democratic Party, and only 37% viewed the Republican Party positively. So with this in mind, the Forward Party bears watching in future elections. Another issue that received some attention in the 2025 election and should be of interest to moderates was ranked choice voting. In a ranked choice voting system, as I explained in episode 1, voters rank the candidates in order of preference, indicating their first choice, second choice, and so forth. When the votes are counted, if one candidate gets more than 50% of the vote, he or she wins the election, just as currently is the case. But if no candidate gets 50% of the vote, then the candidate with the least votes is eliminated, and the people who voted for that candidate would have their votes transferred to their second choice. This process continues until one candidate has a majority of the votes. Please watch episode 1 if you haven't already for a further explanation of ranked choice voting. In any event, as reported by the Independent Voter News, in the 2025 election, voters in Greenbelt, Maryland approved ranked choice voting in local elections by a 2-to-1 margin, specifically 67% in favor. The newly elected city council must still give its final approval for the measure to be adopted. And in another interesting development regarding ranked choice voting, Fair Vote issued a report which noted that in many places around the U.S., the 2025 election actually is still ongoing. Recall from my first video that Fair Vote is a nonpartisan organization that seeks better elections by researching and advancing voting reforms, and whose website is at fairvote.org. Fair Vote noted in their report that several cities and states will need to hold delayed runoffs in the coming weeks and months because no candidate won a majority of the vote. The places that must hold these runoffs include some significant locations like Albuquerque, New Mexico, Miami, Florida, Jersey City, New Jersey, Santa Clara County, California, and Texas's 18th Congressional District. What I found really interesting about Fair Vote's report is that runoffs are supposed to ensure that elected officials have a majority support, but as Fair Vote noted, the turnout in runoff elections often plummets. The report notes that 81% of candidates who won runoffs in 2024 received fewer votes in the runoff than they did in the initial election, essentially negating the runoff's purpose. In contrast, the ranked choice voting system is designed to ensure that there will always be a winner with a majority vote, after taking into account the second and third choices, etc., of the voters. As such, another reason for places like Albuquerque and Miami to consider adopting ranked choice voting, apart from the advantages I mentioned in my first video, is that it actually would be faster and cheaper than holding a runoff election. And elections, it turns out, aren't cheap. The Fair Vote report notes, for example, that the last time Albuquerque had a runoff election in 2023 for a city council seat, the county clerk requested $1.2 million from the county commission to conduct the runoff for that single seat, and turnout declined by 37%. That sure doesn't sound like the most efficient or cost-effective approach to me. Okay, so those are a few quick observations about the 2025 election results from where I sit as a political moderate. But what do you think? Did I cover the main points, or is there something more you'd like to add? Please don't hesitate to leave a comment below, as I'm anxious to get your feedback. Thanks for watching, and I look forward to seeing you again in my next video.